policy which is contained in the outline presented in the book is one of three elements of policy about which the future existence of civilization depends, including the continuation of civilization even as far distant as the end of this century. It is a policy which, in part, the Landbridge element, has been adopted by China, which is now receiving cooperation from Iran, significant cooperation from Iran, for reasons which Helga will indicate, has recently received endorsement and offers of cooperation from the President of India in meetings, public meetings with Jiang Zemin of China. It has the expressed interest of Turkey by the present Prime Minister Erbakan in terms of cooperation with Iran. Recently, we've had the government of Armenia has emphasized its importance of its collaboration with Iran because of this kind of policy. It has the support in significant degree of the Foreign Ministry of Russia, Evgeny Primakov, and in the most recent period, since the French government has broken with the British government in a dramatic move over the issue of British Commonwealth genocide in Africa, that the French government has entered into new degrees of cooperation with Germany, both against British Commonwealth genocide in Africa and also in support of Germany's, France's, Russia's, and other countries' interest in cooperation with Iran, with India, with Asia and Russia in developing this type of orientation of economic cooperation across Eurasia, across continental Eurasia, and into Africa. Now, the background of this is how we got into this business. It started formally in 1982-83, when I was invited by representatives of the U.S. executive branch to set up a back-channel discussion with the Soviet government. And it was agreed that the subject of my discussion would include, among other things, a presentation of my design for a strategic ballistic missile defense to be mutually supported, hopefully, by both governments, the development of which would be utilized to provide new technologies for recovery of the world in general from the economic disaster which was already then in progress. During 1982, from February of 82 to February of 1983, I conducted negotiations through this back channel with the Soviet government. In February, the Soviet government turned down the policy recommendation I made, though they were still interested in economic discussions. But in March of the same year, 23rd, the President of the United States, Reagan, adopted and presented the policy which I'd been discussing with the Soviets and became known as the Strategic Defense Initiative. Now, in the process of those discussions, in February, my last meeting with the Soviet representative, I met the same gentleman recently in Russia. We had some reminiscence on these things. But in my last meeting, I warned him that if the President of the United States were to offer the kind of cooperation which I had outlined to him and his government, and that if the Soviet government refused that offer of Reagan's, then within about 5 years, the Soviet economy would collapse. Right? Now, 1988 came 5 years later. In Berlin, on October 12th of 1988, as a part of my Democratic nomination presidential campaign at the time, I gave a Columbus Day press conference in Berlin, in which I announced the imminent disintegration of the Comecon and Warsaw Pact in their present form, and indicated both that Poland would probably be the first nation to break out of the Comecon-Warsaw Pact alliance, and secondly, that Berlin would likely become soon the designated new capital of a unified Germany. I indicated that we must take, from the standpoint of the United States, that for the coming period of the coming administration, the primary policy question on the table of the United States would be the breakup of the Warsaw Pact-Comecon alliance, and that the United States would have to base its global policy on that fact as the central feature of the strategic landscape for the coming period. Within a few months, I also broadcast this on the national television broadcast here in the United States, a televised copy of that address which I gave in Berlin at the Berlin press conference. Within about a year from there, as we all know, the Berlin Wall began to crumble. It had started, as I had indicated earlier, in Poland, which was the first nation to break the Comecon bonds. Then in October through December of 1989, the Berlin Wall crumbled. And there were two policies on the table of the world. One was the policy which I'd indicated, that we must reach out to the former Soviet Union and the states of Eastern Europe to create a new form of economic cooperation, based in part on the fact that in the Soviet military-industrial sector, there was one of the most important concentrations of strategic machine tool capability in the world. And the collaboration between the United States and France and Germany, especially Germany, with that sector would be the potential science technology driver for a generalized world recovery. That was my policy. It was also the policy of a leading German banker, Alfred Herrhausen of Deutsche Bank, who unfortunately was assassinated in British interest in November of that year on the basis of a similar policy which he had enunciated for Eastern Europe. The other policy was the policy of Margaret Thatcher and the person she describes as her little poodle dog, President George Bush, who she could do anything she wanted to make him do. I asked Helga about that, how that works. Sometimes the dogs make you do what you want them to. They want you to do, but they other way. So Bush and Thatcher took the wrong policy. We're now in a global disaster. The likelihood of civilization surviving in its present form to the end of the century is almost zero. We are presently in the worst financial crisis in the history of modern Europe. Within a matter of weeks or months, some say weeks, some say months, it doesn't make any difference. The Titanic is sinking anyway, and the day in which it sinks is not the issue. The question is, do we have the sense to get off the ship before it sinks? Not can we, like the hogs on Wall Street, wait till the last moment to get out of the market just before it collapses. That's people get slaughtered doing that. So the two issues are this. First of all, to deal with this crisis and the banking system collapse is inevitable. It is not because Japan's bad policy or somebody else's bad policy. It's because of everybody's bad policy. The IMF's bad policy, London's bad policy, our bad policy. We've been destroying modern economy. We've lowered the productive powers of labor. Most parts of the third world, especially Africa and to some degree Central and South America, are suffering far more than they ever did 30 years ago. The condition of mankind in general on this planet is far worse than it was 30 years ago in physical parameters. Yes, there is a facade, one might say a Potemkin village facade of prosperity still around the planet. It's like one of these houses you get in Northern Virginia. It's all facade, but the inside is not worth having. And you can charge you $250,000 or more for the experience of having the house collapse around you. And that's our economy. As a result of this kind of economy, we have built up the greatest financial bubble in history. A bubble which amounts to trading of about $3 trillion a day, where the support is collapsing from underneath it. This bubble will collapse. Nothing can prevent this bubble from collapsing, except putting it into bankruptcy. Therefore, there are three elements which are required to get out of this mess. First of all, a number of governments, led by the United States executive, that means President Clinton in this period, whatever you think of Clinton, he's got the ball, must initiate an emergency new Bretton Woods conference to reestablish immediately the best features of the Bretton Woods system prior to 1966. That is, a system of stable parities, a system whose trade and tariff agreements are essentially protectionist in nature, a system to foster cheap credit for long-term investment in international markets, and to foster scientific and technological progress. A new Bretton Woods, which must essentially meet over a weekend, declare the present international monetary and financial institutions to be bankrupt, to agree to put these institutions into government-supervised receivership for reorganization, to prevent social chaos, and to preserve essential structure of fiscal and financial administration, and to foster cancel all existing trade and tariff agreements, to set up a new set of mutually advantageous protectionist arrangements in order to foster investment and growth within national sectors. Once that's done, the second thing is to find a major series of projects which can lead to an economic recovery in the sense that Roosevelt, during the late 1930s, conceived an economic recovery of the United States. You must have large-scale infrastructure projects, otherwise no economic recovery. And this world is a mess. Most of the world does not function precisely because there's not the infrastructure present in terms of transportation, power, and so forth to enable the world to function. You can't have peace in the Middle East because there's not enough water in the area of Palestine adjoining Jordan to sustain the existing population. Without large-scale water development projects, which includes desalination on a mass scale, there's no possibility of peace in the Middle East, as typical of the infrastructure projects. The problems in Africa are largely the key economic problem is infrastructure. Clean water to drink, efficient transportation, adequate power resources. Without these elements, there is no hope of economic development in Africa. In Asia, we have the greatest concentration of the world's population, with a totally inadequate inland infrastructure development. The greatest part of the human population ready for growth, but unable to do so effectively for reason of lack of adequate development of infrastructure. So therefore, the Eurasian Landbridge conception, an idea which was initially presented in the 1860s by Henry C. Carey, the economist who was also a partner of President Abraham Lincoln. And Carey proposed that the lessons of Europe and the United States in opening up the western lands from the Atlantic to the Pacific, and then similarly in Europe, through railroad development corridors, be utilized throughout Eurasia from the Atlantic to the Pacific and to the Indian Ocean to accomplish similar results in Eurasia. This policy presented by Carey, which was later adopted by important circles in Germany, was spread into Russia, into China and others, and resulted in a policy which caused Britain to organize World War I. That is the so-called Landbridge program of certain French interests associated with Sadi Carnot, the president of France who was assassinated, with Gabriel Anatole, the foreign minister and historian, with Count Sergei Witte of Russia, with circles around the Chinese movement of Sun Yat-sen in China, with interests pre-1894 interests in Japan of the Meiji Restoration, were all agreed on the development of railroad development corridors, not just railroad tracks, railroad development corridors, such as we had used in the United States in developing the western lands of the United States through railway corridors. That must be done throughout Asia. And people associated with the Bates tradition in the United States, with Emil Rathenau and Siemens and others in Germany, the forces I indicated in France, the circles of Dmitry Mendeleev and of Witte in Russia, were united in developing a series of railroad corridors which would extend from the Atlantic, from the coast of France to the Pacific, across to the islands, and down railroad connections down into Japan itself. The same thing to be done toward the Indian Ocean. The British said plainly at that time that this proposal was a threat to the British Empire. The development of a continental communications network of this type would mean that continental power of the Eurasian landmass would dominate over the maritime power of the British Empire, and that the British Empire would not tolerate. And thus the British succeeded by a number of measures in organizing World War I to prevent that from occurring. Now it's back on the agenda. Again, the British are prepared to destabilize China, prepared to destabilize Iran, destroy it, and so forth and so on, to prevent this project from occurring. The third element, the additional Landbridge program, which is our great recovery program for this planet for the 21st century, is the return to the machine tool principle. The problem we have in Asia, now Japan has a very good machine tool sector, though it's not being helped by the current financial situation or trade situation. Korea has a decent machine tool sector. Taiwan has relatively a very good machine tool sector. The Philippines used to have a bit of a machine tool sector until they shut it down and packed it up and shipped it out back to the United States. Indonesia has a very limited machine tool sector, chiefly under the top-down organization of Professor Habibi. Other states in Southeast Asia either have no machine tool sector or virtually none. In India, there's a machine tool sector which is very inadequate relative to the population. China has a machine tool sector which is being fostered, but it's inadequate relative to the population. We have destroyed the strategic machine tool sector in the United States has been virtually destroyed. We have depended upon Germany and Japan for the key elements of our machine tool sector. Without a strategic machine tool sector, you cannot maintain the rate of progress in the productive powers of labor which are needed to sustain a global recovery program. Without the fostering of the machine tool sector, the strategic machine tool sector, the type we used to associate with military technology, without that you cannot muster the intellectual force needed to increase the productive powers of labor sufficiently to meet the moral requirement which we have to humanity in the coming period. And though those three things are the foundations of a recovery policy, a survival policy for civilization, for the remainder of this century and the next century. And the Landbridge program is at the center of it. Helga, who worked with me closely with others in 89 and 90 in developing this program around the so-called Productive Triangle program in Europe, has been through various phases of this. She's been involved in discussions with China at a high level, discussions with other countries or coordinating that. Michel, Liebisch, and Arno have been similarly involved with that directly and indirectly. So Helga will present the vital elements of the Landbridge program as such, and then in the question period you can ask us, including we have Mr. Michel Liebig and Mr. Arno Hellenbroich also available to answer your questions. Thank you. Helga?
First slide, please. First. This European Eurasian land bridge is, no matter what the media says or not, the most important strategic question of today. And the success of the economic integration of the Eurasian continent on a very high-level technological basis will determine the fate of mankind. And this is not a question in the very far future ahead, but I think that considering the different strategic parameters, the question if the second Clinton administration takes a positive attitude to make it a foreign policy strategic interest of the United States to support the success of this Eurasian land bridge, or if they remain indifferent, passive, or worse, will indeed determine if mankind plunges into an incredible catastrophe of which the developments in Africa give us a small foretaste, or if we are in front of the biggest economic miracle in world history. This alternative is directly in front of us. And I think next, if you the reason why this question is the most important is fairly obvious. If you look at the population density in the world today, you can see very clearly that the largest concentration of the world population is in China and Southeast Asia and South Asia, very thinly sprinkled in concentrations elsewhere. And this part of the world, South Asia, West Asia, Southeast Asia, is also going to be the area of the largest population growth in the next century. China presently represents 1.2 billion people. It is presently the most populous nation on the world, and it has, without any question, had the most intensive positive economic development of any country on this planet in the last 12 to 17 years, average 10, even 12% annual growth. Now, the fascinating thing right now is that at the Davos World Economic Forum, despite a rather hysterical misreporting by the international press, the Eurasian Landbridge and the economic development of China, but in a new way also of India, is the most debated topic in Davos in the last couple of days. It is very funny that, while for a long time Mr. LaRouche was like a sole caller in the desert, warning about the imminent collapse of the financial system, advocating the Eurasian Landbridge, and the international media basically denying both realities. As a matter of fact, not reporting about the true condition of the world financial system, but equally, absolutely not reporting about the emerging alternative reality in the form of the Eurasian Landbridge. Now, all of a sudden, at the Davos summit, both realities are popping out and are on the table. Because the two issues which were debated there by some of the world-leading financial, economic, and political leaders was, on the one side, the imminent financial crash of the speculative bubble, possibly triggered by the crisis in Japan or other factors, the systemic crisis of the system as a whole, but also the Eurasian Landbridge. And some people were completely annoyed about the self-assuredness with which the Chinese representative and the Prime Minister of India presented the development perspectives of their respective countries in Davos. But let me first give you a taste of what is the debate, especially in Europe, about the imminence of the financial crash, because I don't think that those of you who looked at the State of the Union address of President Clinton last night got the full flavor of what the debate right now is. The director of the Institute for International Economics in Washington, C. Fred Bergston, did make a speech at the Davos conference warning of the new dangers to the financial system coming from Japan, triggered by the yen crisis, plus the overall economic situation in Japan, which would pose new threats to the international system. He says there's the danger of a vicious circle, a weakness of the financial system in Japan, combined with a Japanese restrictive monetarist policy, which could lead to a continuous fall of the yen. Panic selling could hit Japan in the stock market. Then banks would have no choice than to liquidate their foreign assets. This would then have devastating consequences on foreign markets. And then in addition, you could have new Mexico-style crises in the emerging markets at any moment, most likely Brazil and Argentina, and that could then trigger a chain reaction all over the world. Next. But this was not the only voice. In the meantime, you have European conservative financial dailies like the Neue Zürcher Zeitung, which is like the paper favor of Swiss banking and conservative circles, on the 24th of January, reporting in a big banner headline, are the stock markets in front of a new crash, comparison to the developments of 1929 and 1887. So Professor Gerhard Aschinger from the University of Fribourg basically describes that his scenario of the coming crash is divided into 6 phases leading up to a market crash. And he says we are presently in the 5th phase, passing into the 6th. The 5th phase is characterized by euphoria and irrational behavior by those people speculating in the market in terms of a mass psychology. Then in the 6th phase, a panic erupts and the bubble bursts. He says that the transition from the 5th to the 6th phase can be triggered by events and news which are not so important in themselves, but because they lead to an upset in the expectation to make just a little bit more profit in the speculation, the mass psychology will then turn into a panic. He says that the fact that the Dow Jones has risen by 70% since the beginning of 95 till the end of 96 can only be compared to the speculative bubble of the 27-29 period. And he also completely agrees on that point with Mr. LaRouche that the longer the bubble continues to grow, the larger the crash implosion will be. But these are not individual voices. I will give you some more to show you that right now there is an entire chorus of people warning about the impending crash, what up to recently only Mr. LaRouche and our organization has said. On January 15th, in Frankfurt, the president of the German Savings and Loans Association, Horst Köhler, warned that overnight waves of chaotic currency speculations could erupt. On 19th of January, at a seminar of the Protestant Academy of Tutzing, the former chief economist of the Bavarian Hypo Bank, Volker Hölterhoff, says the world financial markets are incredibly endangered. The arch-monetarist of Deutsche Bank, Norbert Walter, says the world financial markets are decoupled completely from the real economy. Especially dangerous, the derivatives and the breathtaking volume of these derivatives is absolutely frightening. 20th of January, Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung predicts that the stock market hype in New York and Europe is just the buying spree based on the assumption that the party will be over soon. Le Monde, 21st of January, is the financial world going up in flames. They have a 3-page supplement of the danger of a financial blowout that basically saying that alone during the first 9 months of the last year of 1995, of 96, 1,195 billion of stocks and bonds have been issued. It is 1.1 trillion dollar stocks and bonds have been issued. In which context they quote the US stockbroker Charles Schwab saying, how can anyone not tremble when imagining the consequences of an eventual brutal displacement of such masses of capital? Now, this gives you the setting of why there is no way how this world will survive unless we do very soon the kind of reorganization Mr. LaRouche has proposed, why we need a new Bretton Woods system, and why after the reorganization of the world financial system, the Eurasian Landbridge must be the cornerstone of a global reconstruction of the world economy.
The policy which is contained in the outline presented in the book is one of three elements of policy about which the future existence of civilization depends, including the continuation of civilization even as far distant as the end of this century. It is a policy which, in part, the Landbridge element, has been adopted by China, which is now receiving cooperation from Iran, significant cooperation from Iran, for reasons which Helga will indicate, has recently received endorsement and offers of cooperation from the President of India in meetings, public meetings with Jiang Zemin for recovery of the world in general from the economic disaster which was already then in progress. During 1982, from February of 82 to February of 1983, I conducted negotiations through this back channel with the Soviet government. In February, the Soviet government turned down the policy recommendation I made, though they were still interested in economic discussions. But in March of the same year, 23rd, the President of the United States, Reagan, adopted and presented the policy which I'd been discussing with the Soviets and became known as the Strategic Defense Initiative. Now, in the process of those discussions, in February, my last meeting with the Soviet representative, I met the same gentleman recently in Russia. We had some reminiscence on these things. But in my last meeting, I warned him that if the President of the United States were to offer the kind of cooperation which I and other countries' interest in cooperation with Iran, with India, with Asia and Russia in developing this type of orientation of economic cooperation across Eurasia, across continental Eurasia, and into Africa. Now, the background of this is how we got into this business. It started formally in 1982-83, when I was invited by representatives of the U.S. executive branch to set up a back-channel discussion with the Soviet government. And it was agreed that the subject of my discussion would include, among other things, a presentation of my design for a strategic ballistic missile defense to be mutually supported, hopefully, by both governments, the development of which would be utilized to provide new technology had outlined to him and his government. And that if the Soviet government refused that offer of Reagan's, then within about 5 years, the Soviet economy would collapse. Right? Now, 1988 came 5 years later. In Berlin, on October 12th of 1988, as a part of my Democratic nomination presidential campaign at the time, I gave a Columbus Day press conference in Berlin, in which I announced the imminent disintegration of the Comecon and Warsaw Pact in their present form, and indicated both that Poland would probably be the first nation to break out of the Comecon-Warsaw Pact alliance, and secondly, that Berlin would likely become soon the designated new capital of a unified Germany. I indicated of China. It has the expressed interest of Turkey by the present Prime Minister Erbakan in terms of cooperation with Iran. Recently, we've had the government of Armenia has emphasized its importance of its collaboration with Iran because of this kind of policy. It has the support in significant degree of the Foreign Ministry of Russia, Evgeny Primakov, and in the most recent period, since the French government has broken with the British government in a dramatic move over the issue of British Commonwealth genocide in Africa, that the French government has entered into new degrees of cooperation with Germany, both against British Commonwealth genocide in Africa and also in support of Germany's, France's, Russia's,